Join me today as I make winter staples for meal prep so easy you can do it with a toddler with you. Today I am making 3 winter staples: chicken noodle soup, beef stew, and chicken and rice as meal preps for my family. I'll spend less than 75 minutes in the kitchen and I'll make all of our meals for the week. Right now I'm washing up the vegetables, just some celery, carrots, some red potatoes, a bell pepper, and some broccoli, and some parsley, and getting those ready for when I do my food prep. I don't peel carrots or peel potatoes really in any case, so I'm just giving these a quick scrub so that I can chop them and use them with their skins on when I use them in the recipes. And I skip all kinds of steps like this, and you'll even see this if you ever look at the recipes that I use for these meal preps. Sometimes they'll suggest that you brown the stew meat before you use it, and though I understand that this builds flavor, I think that I'm trying to skip as many steps as I possibly can and still have food on my table. So if you're looking for delicious, healthy meals, but without a lot of extra fuss, then certainly this method could work for you. Well, before we get started cooking, will you take a minute to like this video and subscribe to this channel? I have gathered up all of my ingredients and I've washed my produce. I've got my Old Faithful chopped onions and then a few pantry staples, as well as a couple of quarts of homemade chicken broth. And I'm going to go ahead and get started here by chopping up this bell pepper. I'm just cutting this up into squares. I'll be making some roasted veggies to go alongside the chicken and rice dish. So I'll be putting that on a parchment lined baking sheet along with a half of a red onion, which I have left over from my last week's meal prep. You could use any onion, and then some broccoli florets as well. Typically, I would take the help from the store and buy the broccoli already cut into florets, but there was a big outbreak, and so I was a little nervous about that and wanted to cut that up myself. And as you saw in the beginning, my son is hanging around while I'm cooking today. And I just want to encourage you that you don't have to cook kid-free, and you can do this during the waking hours of your children's lives. And I just hear so much about people meal prepping and talking about how if you're going to make all these meals in advance, just be sure that you can order pizza that night because you'll be so wiped out, and maybe get a babysitter or do this during your nap time. And I just feel like the time is so short and there's just not enough time for all of that. And so I need to be able to cook simple enough meals that I can do them while sometimes hanging out with my toddler and still in a really short amount of time. So if you're in that boat, then I completely understand and just would encourage you that this can be done. And honestly, it was motherhood that made me start cooking this way instead of cooking every night. So I just felt like it was really challenging to cook when my son was so young. And now I honestly do it because I'd like to spend time with him in the evening rather than preparing food. So I'm getting out my Instant Pot and my crock pot liner, and I'm going to put about half of the carrots in each one of those vessels. The Instant Pot will have the chicken noodle soup, and the crock pot will have the beef stew in it. And by using some of the same vegetables and just chopping them twice, I always feel like that kind of saves money for sure because you're not buying as many ingredients, but also time because you're just kind of doing the same chopping of more quantity of an item. And so the same thing is going on with the celery. I'll chop half of this for the beef stew and the other half for the chicken noodle soup. And now I'm cutting up those red potatoes, which I will put into the beef stew. And as I mentioned earlier, not peeling these or taking any time for any extra fuss with these, just cubing these up and throwing them into my crock pot. This is a really delicious beef stew recipe, and if your family is at all tomato averse, then you might really enjoy it. I feel like usually beef stew has diced tomatoes or tomato sauce or tomato paste or even all three. And this doesn't actually have any of those, but it still has a really great flavor profile. It has quite a bit of potato in it, and you could always reduce that if you wanted to, but I think it's kind of nice because then you don't really have to serve anything alongside this. A lot of times when I make beef stew, I'll make mashed potatoes to kind of go at the base of the bowl, but I don't feel like you have to do that with this one. I'm adding a bag of frozen chopped onions to each of these soup pots. And I love the frozen chopped onions from Walmart. They sell them at other grocery stores too. I really don't chop onions anymore. And then I am just putting a little drizzle of olive oil over my vegetables, and I'll put salt and pepper on these and put them in an oven at 400 degrees, and I'll just let them get kind of roasted. The key here is just to make sure you're spreading them out nicely on your sheet pan so that they have plenty of room to get brown, and that way they'll roast and not steam. So sticking those into my oven, and I've got the oven set at 400 degrees. I'll also be adding some chicken to that to roast for my soup. So next I am seasoning up the chicken, again adding a little olive oil to that and then putting some spices on this. Now, I grew up eating chicken noodle soup, probably similar to what you did, and I didn't find it to be particularly flavorful. I feel like it just sort of tasted like broth with chicken and carrots and celery in it. And I came across this recipe a few years ago, and I think it's the spices that you put on the chicken that really make it. It has spices that maybe you wouldn't think of for chicken noodle soup, but in quantities that it makes for a really flavorful soup, but it doesn't like make it into a soup that you wouldn't recognize as chicken noodle soup. So it has chili powder and cumin and oregano and garlic powder and salt and pepper on the chicken, and you roast it in the oven and shred it up that way rather than like cooking a whole chicken or chicken parts on the bone or something like that in the chicken pot, which is kind of how I've seen chicken noodle soup made traditionally. And this just makes for such a flavorful soup. Anybody I make this for, anytime they're sick or anytime my family is sick, we just love this. And it has such great flavor, but also, I mean, I feel like you are just good as new if you feel any inkling of sickness. So definitely this is a favorite. Now, I am gluten free, and so I don't actually make this with noodles. You could use gluten free noodles, but I just use zucchini noodles in this. So I'll show you that later, but my chicken is now seasoned up, so I'm ready to stick that in the oven, also at 400 degrees right next to my roasted veggies. And now it's time for me to get started on making the seasoning for my chicken and rice skillet. So I'm putting some ghee, which is kind of a oil that you can heat to a pretty high smoke point, if you will, in this large skillet, and I'll use that to cook up some chicken thighs. I just need to brown them on either side, but before I do that, I'm going to season them up with some paprika and thyme and some oregano and salt and pepper and garlic powder. And this makes for a really flavorful way to season up the chicken. And I am just so amazed at all the different flavor combinations you can come up with just by using spices. And I know people talk about spices as though they're really expensive, but honestly, pre-made sauces and flavor packets and all that kind of thing are way more expensive than just opening your spice cabinet. And especially if you buy spices in the bulk bins and just refill your containers rather than buying individual containers of spices, you'll find that spices are quite inexpensive. So it's a great way to flavor your food. So I am finishing this up, and I'll go ahead and season up my boneless, skinless chicken thighs with this on both sides, and then I'll stick them in the skillet to brown up. While those are browning up, I will go ahead and finish getting my beef stew ready to get started. So I am adding some mustard to this. You add about 2 tablespoons of mustard, and I'm kind of at the end of this jar. So I ended up putting a little bit of broth that I will ultimately put in the soup in here and just shaking out the rest of it just to clear out this container. And then you also use a tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce, and a tablespoon of soy sauce, or in my case, tamari, because tamari is gluten free. And then you add some herbs like thyme and rosemary, about 2 cups of broth. I'm using chicken broth. The recipe calls for beef broth, but I almost never have homemade beef broth. And I'm going ahead and getting that started. I'm also adding 8 cloves of garlic to the chicken noodle soup, which is a lot of garlic, but it honestly doesn't make you feel like you have like dragon breath or something. So go ahead and add it. It's very healing. And then a quart of chicken stock. If you're using this with noodles, go ahead and add a quart of water as well. But because I won't be cooking noodles in this, I don't need the extra liquid for the noodles to cook in. So my chicken thighs are browned on each side, and I'm going ahead and sauteing an onion and also the rice in here, and then adding some chicken stock to get all those little browned bits off of the bottom of the pan. And I did cook my chicken in 2 batches just so as not to overcrowd it. Again, you just get better color that way on the chicken. And so I think I ended up with 7 or 8 chicken thighs for this. And then I will be putting them back into the pot with the broth, and that's a cup of uncooked rice in there. And then I'll just close this lid and cook this for about 20 more minutes. And the rice will cook up and the chicken will finish cooking through. And this will be a really easy meal. I love one pot meals, and I love things where like the carb can just cook in with it. I just find that to be so convenient, and then it usually makes that carb really flavorful. I don't want to miss out on any of the flavor from that chicken, so I'm adding those juices back in before I close this up to cook. And now I'm checking my oven because my roasted vegetables are already done, and my chicken is cooked through and ready to be shredded up and added to the Instant Pot. And then I can get my Instant Pot started so that my soup can be cooking. I really love how the Instant Pot makes such quick work of developing flavor in a soup, even in just a few minutes. I just set my Instant Pot for about 10 minutes when I make soup, and I just feel like it gives it the flavor that it's been cooking all day just from being cooked under pressure. So I do love an Instant Pot. I know it's kind of a novel appliance, and some people have just decided that it's not worth it, but to me, I love it. So my chicken and rice is all done, and you can see the rice is nice and fluffy and chicken is cooked through. These are zucchini noodles from my freezer, and I just save these when I'm doing my gardening during the summer. I just use like a handheld spiralizer to spiralize those up. And each bag has about 2 zucchinis in it, and I'll just add those to this soup, which is hot. And very quickly they thaw out and are just fine in the soup. And so I just take a clean pair of scissors and reach in there and just kind of snip the noodles when it's all said and done so that they aren't like way too long to be able to enjoy this soup. But in a couple of minutes, these are just completely thawed out. And I just love the extra veggies that this adds. And really, it's just so flavorful with the broth. But you wouldn't want to put the zucchini noodles in before you cook it in the Instant Pot, or they would just turn to mush. And then the beef stew is all ready, so I'm adding a little bit of chopped parsley to that just to give it a nice fresh pop of color and a little flavor too. I sure appreciate you joining me today, and I hope you'll try these winter staples for your own family of chicken and rice, chicken zoodle soup, and beef stew. And I hope you'll be back on the next one. Meanwhile, like and subscribe.